Servus, hello, and bonjour. Matthias Eichler here, and this is Singletrack. Samuel Hartman joins us this week on Singletrack to share his tale of conquering TDS this past week. TDS, the harder UTMB race from Courmayeur to Chamonix, the other way around, has been Samuel's dream for many years and had been delayed by lots of complications. This year, he found himself at the starting line. We talk about the challenges of training for a mountain race in his flat Ohio, the brilliance of combining your European vacation with a big trail adventure, and his unique perspective as a race director himself of the 10-hour race series on the giant spectacle that is UTMB. Well, it's been a crazy UTMB week, and I'm excited to share with you a fun conversation that'll give you a unique insight into the event and hopefully want to make you race there sometime too, just like me. All right, let's get to it. Here's Samuel. Samuel Hartman from Ohio. You have to pinpoint me more directly and not just one big state. Welcome to Singletrack.
Thank you, Matthias, for having me. I live in Columbus, which is the capital of Ohio. It's like right in the center. And it's funny when I tell people like in Europe that I'm from Ohio, they always think they know where it is, but they're usually wrong. And I certainly don't blame them for that. Like if somebody told me a random city in France, I probably wouldn't know where it is if it wasn't Paris or Chamonix, for example. But yeah, it's really flat here. I have to drive an hour to a state park, and the biggest climb there is 500 feet of vert. So it's like, I don't know, like 120 meters or something. So that's the scene to paint here. It's really flat.
It's really flat. You know, we connected early in the year for the Trail Running Film Festival. You were one of our amazing hosts, and going through and setting up all these host locations gave me an incredible education of where different places are in the country. And I've learned a lot. And one of the things that I've said to a lot of hosts as we had these phone calls is that it's not arrogance, right? It's sort of, you just don't know, right? If you've never been in a place, you just don't know about locations, but you get to know not just places, but also communities and places where people run and trails and stuff. And I would have actually liked to travel more and get to know some of these locations because, like yours, you don't just are a single man in the middle of flat nowhere having to travel to a state park forever. You've actually built a community around you, which, you know, enabled you to host a film festival. Let's start there. You are not just a trail runner in seeking vert. Tell me a little bit about your race directing and everything else.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the Trail Running Film Fest was really cool because Columbus already had a history with that film fest. But in the last couple years, I think that was directly related to COVID. It just had like not happened, or whoever had done it in the past didn't pick up the ball or whatever. So when I saw that it was available, I reached out as my race company, which is TINAR, TINAR Race Series. And we started in the middle of COVID in 2020 with like a really small race, and we've grown it to two sizable races, an ultra marathon and then a trail marathon that we do in the fall. Our next race is coming up in October this year. And so as that sort of race company, we hosted the film fest. And yeah, it was like this really, I mean, it was really small, I think, compared to a lot of your host cities. Like we only had 50 people, but like the venue we picked, like we sold it out. Like that was the maximum capacity. And so everybody there like got to talk to one another. We had raffle, we had food, we had like all this really like incredibly dense like 3 hours like packed into the evening. And then the films themselves was almost like the icing on the cake because it was like, oh, now we're going to transport across the world to go watch these people run, or you know, hear about the Footprints running camp or the naked film about what the naked sports one that about Brendan Doogie. I mean, that one really stuck with me. And so all that stuff, it's like the films were kind of in the background, but at the same time, it was the reason we all came there. But just to see all the other runners in street clothes and be like, oh, hey, you were at that race 6 months ago. Like, it was a really cool experience.
Yeah.
And it also propelled what I'm trying to do more, which is, yeah, to build that community, to get people to come out, try trail racing for the first time, or come to a really incredible ultra marathon if they're already an experienced runner, win some cash prizes, and just grow the sport in general.
That is so great to hear. And in some way, you said almost apologetically that your location was a small venue, but I don't think that that really is what it was about, right? It's not just about the numbers. It's about, for you, number one, picking the right venue that you want to host in, and that also matches your size of community at this point. And so I think that's exactly the kind of venues that we want for the film festival. That's the kind of communities that we want to connect with, right? And I think that perfectly works. And yeah, big numbers isn't what it's always about, right? It is
Yeah,
about bringing
yeah,
people together, and as you described, right, seeing them in not running clothes and in a different atmosphere is kind of a fun way of extending sort of our community beyond the training and the physical athletic efforts that we're sort of
yeah.
anchoring our sport around, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I should mention too, one of those films was I believe called, wasn't the title like Nettie from Ohio?
Yeah.
And so like we had that like local tie, and they did their own showing in Dayton. But we all were like, oh my God, this woman from Ohio is like in it, doing Western States, traveling around to do all these crazy races. And so to see Annetta up there, like that was really cool because many of us knew her personally or like had known her story over the years. And I do want to ask though, like you talked about learning all the different places. Like, didn't we have like 3 or 4 showings just in Ohio? Which like I don't know, to me seems surprising. Like even though I'm from Ohio.
I think, yes, I was surprised too. I was very surprised that we had more response from what I would consider non-classical trail running towns as opposed to classic trail running towns. Like, I've said this now a couple times on the podcast, but like Boulder
Yeah,
and Bozeman. And so they weren't able to put a show on for whatever reason. But then, we got hosts from places like yours, right? Where
yeah,
it's like, I don't have any connection to this place, and you want to host. How fantastic is that we
yeah,
are able to take this festival? I mean, we were in South Dakota, and we were in some locations that I never would consider to be trail places. But of course, there are trails, right? I mean, there was a location in Indiana, and the host told me that he's running on sand dunes, and I'm like, wait, sand dunes? Where are you at?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And I
yeah,
thought it was super fascinating to learn all these places. But I do also think that Nettie, as the subject of one of the films, certainly sort of created additional interest. And I think we had at least 2 showings in Ohio that sort of came on after we announced that that film was part of
yeah,
the festival, right? And so I think that sort of adds a little bit to sort of where films are being or host locations are being put on. Well, let's switch from there, even though my head is, now that UTMB is over and my big race of the summer is over, I'm switching into film festival sort of mode already and starting to reach out to hosts and filmmakers, and I'm starting to work on this. But this still has a few months to simmer. Let's still talk about what you dressed up as. UTMB hat on, UTMB shirt on, full kitted out. You just came back from Chamonix. You ran TDS.
yeah,
Congratulations. What an incredible feat. TDS is anyway one of the hardest, and the weather was insane. We need to talk about this. Welcome back.
yeah, yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. I mean, I've talked to a number of people about it now, and I've like, I wrote like a brief summary on Strava. I've had this like race report in my mind. It's been swirling around. It's just hard to put into words. I mean, it is just another animal. And, I didn't come from a background of running road marathons that typically would have thousands of runners. Like, I think the biggest trail race I've ever done was maybe like the Quad Dipsy in San Francisco or in Marin County, maybe 400 or 500 runners. So, you know, when you're in the starting corral with 1,600 runners, and then they say go, and then the front people are taking off at like a 6-minute mile. I mean, how do you put that into words? It's crazy.
Yeah.
And as I said on Strava, like it really felt like 3 or 4 races back to back to back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like each 12 hours was like a period of time where I went through this arc of like, oh, this is awesome. Oh, this really sucks. And then in most races that I do, you go through 1 or 2 of those and then the race is over. You're done.
Mm-hmm.
And you get in your car and you drive home, or you go to a hotel and then it's done. The race is done, and then you wake up and you're sore and you go on with your life. And this had a whole prep to it. The whole race was almost 40 hours, and then a whole down, and then the travel back to the United States, and then it's just like, oh my God. I mean, yeah, man, it was insane. I mean, there's really no way to put it. Like, it just, coming from the world of trail running that I'm in, this was like going to the Olympics or something. I mean, they call it the World Series of Trail Running, right? It lives up to that name. And I would say in the best ways and in maybe the worst ways too, because when you have an event that big, inevitably things are going to fall through the cracks. And as a race director, I definitely saw some of that. And it was a little frustrating to be like, oh, I'm the recipient of like these problems too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's start by pulling this a little bit back in timeline. And that is, where did the motivation come from? I mean, you just said that you are training in Flat, Ohio. Where is the motivation to get yourself from Ohio to Chamonix, to the Alps, to run? There are a few races to pick from, not just in the UTMB weekend, but anywhere in the Alps that would be easier. TDS is one of the hardest ones.
Yeah.
How did you find this event?
Yeah.
What made you say this is what I want?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I've probably heard about the race just like in passing over the years. I started like quote unquote seriously running trail ultras in 2017. I would say sometime around 2019. I read a book called The Rise of the Ultra Runners by a British author, Finn. I'll mispronounce his first name. It's like Adarand or something. Really great book. And I mean, this was still when ultra running was like on the way up. It's still on the way up, but now we're like, like you have like multiple New York Times articles about ultra runners like consistently. So I would say that like in some ways we've kind of made it like it is in the public consciousness. I mean, it's not basketball or football, but like it's a thing. And I think that's only going to change. That's only going to get bigger now that Courtney and Jim have like done what they've done. And when they like come home and then now like, ESPN or Sports Illustrated or whatever reaches out to them, it's just going to get more and more massive.
Yeah.
But if you go, even just 4 years back to 2019, it was still smaller. So I read that book, and one of the big arcs in that book is this British author, whose last name is Finn. He goes and does the UTMB race. Because like myself, he heard about it and was like, oh, that's like the pinnacle of trail running. It is the ultimate of ultimate trail races. And I won't say that it's the hardest or the most obscure, right? Like I'm a huge Barkley fan, and like I'll go on about how Barkley is like the hardest and how the most special. But UTMB holds this really amazing, very public, very like deified place in the world of trail running. And it has for 20 years now. And so I read about that, and then I started figuring out, okay, well, if I want to do this, like, how do I qualify? And so I qualified in 2019 by doing a couple different races here in Ohio. Actually, one in Ohio, one in Virginia, that gave me the points needed. And this was back on the old system when you needed points.
Yeah.
Then I I entered the TDS lottery at the end of 2019. I won the lottery in 2020, which was amazing, right? Like first time I've ever entered the lottery for this thing and I win. I have the points. So I was all ready to go to Chamonix in 2020. Well, you know what happened then, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So COVID just annihilated everything. And then I just had a bunch of life stuff kind of get in the way in 21 and 22. And I remember when they sent out the emails to all the runners about deferring, they said you can defer for up to 3 years.
Hmm.
23 is the last year you can defer.
Hmm.
So I really made a plan with my now fiance Marissa of like, hey, if at all possible, we are going to Europe in 2023. You know, we're going to do a vacation and we're going to go to Chamonix and you're going to crew me and it's going to be this whole big thing. And we did it. I mean, we pulled it off and it's like amazing, but you know, it wasn't without its like challenges too.
Yeah.
To your question about why TDS, I mean, I think the answer to that is it was the hardest one.
Hmm.
UTMB is longer, but TDS has about the same amount of vert with less miles. It's like considered technical, which after doing it, honestly, it's no more technical than like any of the stuff in the Sierra Nevadas.
Hmm.
It's hard for sure, but I thought it was going to be like, you know, climbing on hands and knees and stuff. And at least the sections that I did were not like that. It's just classically technical mountain running, you know, rocks and roots and things like that, you know. But yeah, it was just like, you know, everyone was like, oh, TDS is like harder than UTMB. And I was like, well, that's the one for me. Of course.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
I need to quickly interject and say, I think you did it really, really smart by deferring all the way to 23 and gave yourself the proper runway, because I feel like we've seen, especially in 22, when races were really coming back, where a lot of people, and even sort of at the tail end of 21, when people sort of took their deferral and immediately jumped on it, but because COVID messed up so much, either people who got COVID and actually messed up their health, but then also their training plans, races didn't happen. And so I think we saw a fairly large DNF rate during these years when people deferred and were like, well, you know, I get that entry free, so I might as well take it, which wasn't free because I paid for it 2 years ago, right? And so they signed up and then they weren't ready. And so by you sort of taking and saying, no, we're going to do this on the long way and really prep for it,
Yeah.
was a really smart calculation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and to go into that a little bit, and I mean, it's a bit of a interesting story, but like, you know, 2020 was like a year where I was really fit because I was training a lot during COVID because what else would you do? Right. And then in 21, tragically, my mom passed away. And
Mm.
so, you know, I was able to train through all that. But then when 22 hit, the grief of that caught up. And
Mm.
so I actually had like a really bad training year in 22. But what I did was I started a running streak where I would like run a mile a day, like the classic running streak, you know? So I've been doing that all the way since like the middle of 22. And that really propelled me into a really strong training block in 23. And so, I mean, if I just look at like my Strava segments, you know, my Garmin times, going to Chamonix this year, I am a stronger runner in that discipline of like mountain running than I've ever been in my life. So in some ways, again, like to your point, yeah, it's great that I deferred because it gave me the time to
Mhm.
go through the ebbs and flows of life and then finally get to a consistent training block where, you know, I had hundreds of thousands of feet of vert under my legs to be able to go and tackle these mountains.
Yeah, no, amazing. Was it the first time for you in Europe?
I've been to Europe before, like mostly like I've been to Spain a couple times in my
Mhm.
life, but purely for vacation, seeing friends. I also once I this was like a decade ago, traveled to Rome with a partner, just a vacation, like total. I wasn't even running yet. Like I don't think I did a single workout on that whole trip. And now, whenever I travel somewhere, I mean, we were in Como, Italy, you know, like as part of this trip. And I was on Gaia GPS looking up trails, you know, finding what ridge I could run on. And I mean, that's
which
all I
is
do when I travel now.
which is one of the best things to do when traveling, right?
Yeah.
Looking at Strava heat maps and
Yeah.
finding the
Yeah. Yeah.
places to go run. This is incredible. Well, it's the reason why I asked is because I find the combination of vacation and racing really magical. But
Yeah.
if you put too many expectation eggs into that basket, sometimes it can fuck with you, right?
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes if you're not prepared and you have to juggle too many logistical things and you're not aware of, different food and time zones and everything, try
Yeah.
to cram it in, you you end up screwing either you screw up your race or you screw up your vacation. Worst thing
Yeah.
both, right?
No, and I was very sensitive to that, and so that was something that my fiance and I really talked about at length because we've had trips in the past where, yeah, I've kind of taken up a lot of the day running, and it kind of becomes the source of tension of like, well, we were going to go do this thing. Well, there's this peak right here. I got to bag it.
Well, and that part is easier to manage for me than
Yeah,
I got to go to bed early because,
yeah, yeah.
I need to get some sleep and I can't go out and eat this
Oh,
because,
right, right,
I
right.
need to already prepare it. I find that piece even more challenging than hey, let's
Yeah.
go up and do this.
Right, right. So what we did was, we basically said, okay, look, we're gonna block 2 weeks off, approximately a week for the race and all the stuff in Chamonix, because there was a lot we wanted to do there too, and take the tram up and hike around and do all the stuff that you would never be able to do in the United States. And, it's just a crazy atmosphere there. Infrastructure is crazy. Trail markings are like so good. I mean, it's unreal. Um, and my fiance Marissa basically was like, "Look, do you want to explore the cobbles of Europe the week before the race or the week after?" And I
Good,
thought of
good, difficult question. I
yeah,
don't
and
know
I
how I
said,
would answer that on top of my head, right?
"Well, we brainstormed and decided, you know what? The week before the race, what should I be doing? Tapering. I shouldn't be running hard anyway.
Mhm.
The week after the race, I might not even be able to walk." So we did the vacation bit in the front half. We spent some time, I'll briefly say, in Geneva, in Lausanne, Switzerland, and then in Milan, Italy, which was incredible. I had a brief stint in Como that we actually cut short because it was so fucking hot. Oh my god, it was like 100 degrees,
Yeah, nuts.
and nobody has AC.
No air conditioning. I know. It's hard. It's hard. I
I
think.
mean, you've been over there. It's like, oh my God, it's 100 degrees. How do you live without air conditioning? But I understand that's like me as the American saying that, right? And then from Milan, we took like a long kind of circuitous train, no, a bus actually, to Chamonix.
Mhm.
And then when we got to Chamonix, the temperature dropped and it just kept dropping and then started raining all the way into race day.
Yeah. You
So, yeah.
really had like for this entire week, right? I mean, we need to make sure we pictured we paint this picture correctly. All the photos of the main UTMB event from the weekend
Yeah.
where this beautiful sunny blue sky. You were TDS, you were the beginning of the week, you were winter kit activated. This was to add to the more difficulty of the event that was extra hard.
Yeah, I thought the whole mandatory kit thing was a little overblown. And actually, fun trivia fact: I found out from a YouTube video that part of the reason that mandatory kit is so strict is because of Killian. Did you know this?
Okay. I feel
That
like I
he,
know, but
I think the first year he ran the race, he brought all the required items, but like instead of like a space blanket this big, he just brought like a square and stuff. And he was like, I have everything on me, but it's like this big. And they were like, okay, next year we're going to change this.
mhm.
So again, I was like, really? Do I really have to bring waterproof pants and a pair of long
Mhm.
trousers and waterproof gloves? Well, guess what? I am glad I brought all that shit because it was so cold up there. I had all of it on at one point during the
Mhm.
race. I had every single layer I brought on my body. I had waterproof gloves on. I brought mittens that went on top of them that were waterproof. I had a buff on. I had a beanie on. I had the waterproof jacket all the way like sealed up over me. Um, I mean, it was just crazy. I mean, yeah, it felt like I was racing in January or something.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I hear a lot of people kind of question and complain about that, both Europeans and Americans. And I mean, as a race director, given where the UTMB races race, they're really, I mean, it's a little bit like Western States in the early days where they had scales at every aid station and made
Yeah.
people, check. And I think they've gotten more relaxed because they found other ways by, bringing in, hundreds of pounds of bags of ice, and they found other ways of sort of taking care of the runners.
Yeah.
But the reality is that UTMB really makes a big deal about the reality of the trail being in the mountains. And as you were saying, right, it's like you are at long stretches in remote areas. And I mean, they've had multiple deaths over the years,
Yeah.
right? It's not something to be taken lightly, even though, especially when you're packing and trying to pack light for an overseas trip and having to pack essentially two different packs to carry, right? I mean, your summer,
Yeah.
if you had a normal summer kit, you would have taken a different backpack, right? Or a different hydration pack, right?
Yeah, well, I probably would have used the same pack, but I mean, I would have left a lot of the gear out. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the heavy waterproof stuff. There was like a third layer, almost like a fleece, that was only in the winter kit that I
Mm-hmm.
ended up bringing with me. And then, yeah, I think the waterproof gloves were only in the winter kit. And then I had like a thin pair of gloves that I was going to bring anyway. Um, but I mean, I'm really glad I brought all that stuff. I used it. It was cold. There were, and we, I think it was the first night. It was the coldest, and it was that like 4 to 6 a.m. hour where we really were only in the race for 4 or 6 hours at that point. But that's when like the sun hasn't come up yet, and it's been night that whole time. It was really cold. It
Mm-hmm.
was, and once you start to get up into that 7, 8,000 foot range, I mean, there were times where we're going on the trail, which is like covered in mud, which was also really weird because it had rained so much.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're just like, there's like a few inches of snow right next to you. So it's like mud, snow, mud, snow. And then
At
there,
least, at least it's clear where your trail is then, right?
yeah,
You know
yeah.
exactly where you're supposed to be.
Yeah, the course markings were really good, and there was never a question of if you were on trail or not. But I was not ready for that amount of mud, that amount of moisture on course. My
Mm-hmm.
feet got pretty messed up because of how wet everything was, and yeah, it was. From everything I've read and heard, it was a abnormal year for
Mm-hmm.
TDS. One thing I read said that like they have not had weather that extreme in like 10 or 12 years on
Mm-hmm.
that course.
I mean, you know, speaking from a race director point of view, looking at the realities of climate change, I think we'll be
Yeah,
dealing with that more and more, right? Where, 5, 7, 8 years when ultra running first sort of had this kind of first kind of rise, if you will, right? I think that it seemed pretty simple to put on a race. You just had to find the course and the season of the year where that course made sense and you were good to go, right? And
yeah,
now out here in the West with wildfires, smoke, and wildfires destroying entire sections of courses and these crazy weather events, I think it's going to be a lot more tricky to put on races in already potentially challenging locations, right?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I know that UTMB cares a lot about sustainability, and there were a lot of things I saw during the race that really showed that they do. At the same time, I continue to see a large amount of flack because of the title sponsor, Dacia,
Yeah.
and that car partnership. And to be honest, I am a pretty like green environmental person. Like I try to be an environmentalist. I've been vegan for almost 20 years. Like I really give a shit about that stuff. And I don't find the same ire that other people do with the Dacia partnership because if you have a race like UTMB in the mountains, there's pretty much only one way to get the goods to those races, and that's by car or by
Mm-hmm.
truck.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to change that. And I know that Dacia has a whole EV division, and I'm certainly not defending them. I don't really know much about the company. It's a French company, right, or UK car company?
I think traditionally it's actually an East European car
Oh,
company,
yeah.
but
Okay.
it's purchased by one of the big French
Oh, yeah.
Peugeot or something, so
Yeah.
it's a
Maybe Renault,
subsidiary of
actually.
Renault. Oh,
Yeah.
Renault. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so um I think because of that sort of subsidiary purchase, that's how they got to be
Mm,
sponsor, right?
I see. I see. Yeah, because all the money's flowing in, just like with the
Mm-hmm.
Iron Man purchase and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I guess, like, I don't know, from where I sit in the world of environmentalism, like, cars are not the enemy. They're just one more thing that contributes. And we got to look at food. We got to look at local stuff. We got to look at what the industry's doing. And most of the car companies over here are going to all EV anyway, which is the future, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I didn't really find that criticism as warranted as other people, but um, it was interesting to see what choices UTMB made and what choices they didn't in terms of
Mm-hmm.
sustainability. Um,
So
because there were, yeah,
I'm I'm going to put myself here a little bit out on a limb, but the impression that I got with that criticism is, and that's not trying to stereotype or slam anybody, but I get a sense that every trail running community in every country has a certain value system built into it based on how it started, how it's growing. And I feel like the UK trail running community is very strong on environmentalism and activism. I
yeah,
feel like the UK trail running community, more so than other um, countries' trail running communities. And I find it almost feels like, well, I think they're strong in environmentalism, with Damien Hall sort of taking sort of
yeah, yeah.
that spearhead there a little bit, right? But I also feel like I almost get a sense that every year before UTMB really kicks off in the 2-3 weeks, there is some petition floating around. There's some criticism, and almost always it starts to come from the UK. Like they're the ones who sort of bringing it up, and I'm not trying to blame them, but I feel like they're the ones who are strongest, sort of trying to, not point the finger, but hold people accountable, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's good, but I also, if you do this every year with a different thing, it becomes almost a little bit like, is that your shtick? Is that your thing that you do,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah,
And
I listened to several interviews with him after Barkley because he did so well at Barkley this year, and that was Damian Hall I'm talking about, and
mm-hmm,
that was his one race that he flew to,
mm-hmm,
and he made a big point of saying, I'm not going to take the plane, which has massive emissions, to any other race. Barkley was my one race, and I think Jasmine Paris was another. She's part of that cohort too
yeah,
of
yeah,
uh, what's Green Runners, or what's
mm-hmm.
their what's
Something
they
like
have a,
that, yeah,
yeah, they have a name that's
mm-hmm,
like that group of environmental runners all from the UK.
yeah,
That basically were like, yeah, like you have to really pick which race you're going to spend that embodied energy to get
mm-hmm,
to,
yeah,
and everything else should try to be as local as possible. And I think that's great. I mean, I'm all about that. At the same time, as a vegan and as just somebody who lives in Western culture in the United States, there are so many things that are dwarfing the decisions we make
mm-hmm,
in terms of carbon emissions that like could be fixed by powers much larger than us.
mm-hmm,
And our individual decisions, while they do add up and collectively contribute to a lot of carbon emissions, the waste and the energy production that is controlled by much larger corporations that we have no say on really contributes to a much more significant amount than our sort of small decisions about where to travel and what to do.
Yeah.
In my opinion, and I'm certainly not a scientist on this issue, but just from my basic research.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's one of those difficult things where I think it's important to hold the powers that be accountable. And I think it's good that we have people speaking out and trying to keep UTMB in check, right? I think Stephanie Case made a really good point of UTMB needs to be a door and not a mirror, right? It needs to be leading in that sense in anything, in all of these things, and not just sit back and wait and see what the general consensus is and sort of be a follower, right? And so I agree with that, but I also see UTMB currently being in a weird position where they're already really, really big. And so decisions are going to take a lot longer than, if you and I decide for our little races to go cupless overnight, then we send out one email and the decision is made, right? But for them, logistically, it's something that trickles down. And while that can be frustrating, sometimes it just takes a while to make sound decisions. And I don't know, I mean, it almost seems a little bit too strategically smart. But UTMB did have last year a big logistics problem with too many people trying to get from the various aid stations, both spectators and Barrier support crew. And so this whole mobility sort of initiative with buses everywhere and stuff, right? I want to talk to you about on the ground if you feel like it felt reasonably good. And because last year, I think it felt sort of like a general shit show. And I mean, if I think about these valleys, and I'm like, yeah, if you come from it, especially from like sort of an American Western States mindset where every pro runner can have a crew of 15 people driving from aid station to aid station in 4 different vehicles, so to speak, right? I mean, it doesn't work in these tiny valleys up these remote mountain passes, right? You gotta be sort of come up with a completely different plan of how you manage this, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I tell you, I can speak directly to the whole mobility situation because it really ties this whole thing together. I mean, we had our bus tickets reserved to go from Chamonix to Courmayeur, and the tickets said 9:00. And we got some crazy convoluted text message from UTMB at like 7 p.m. that day that said, all the buses are running 45 minutes ahead or behind. No, they're 45 minutes behind. So if it was supposed to leave at 8, it was going to leave at 8:45, right? And your like support person can take a bus later. And I was like, no, I paid €50 so my partner could go with me on the bus to the start. And again, like, I want to acknowledge, like, I'm coming at this from my like sort of tiny privileged world of American ultras, where you wake up in the morning, you get in your car, you grab your partner who's sleep deprived, still in a blanket, you sit in the car for an hour, you drive to the start line, they wave you off, and then you run the race. Not you get on a bus and then 6 hours later you're in a corral with 1,600 people.
I know.
So I'm like, okay, what the hell is going on here? So now she can't take the same bus that I do, all this stuff. So we get to the bus area at like 8:00 just to be safe. They put us both on the same bus without any issues. So we were already confused. Then the bus sits there, tries to get into the tunnel. We wait an hour. We wait another half hour. What was supposed to be a 45-minute bus ride took over 2 hours because of traffic. And then later we learned there was some kind of landslide on one of the other roads that goes like around the mountain. So all the traffic that would normally drive into Courmayeur was actually driving into Chamonix and then through the mountain, like through the tunnel. And like, to the point we're just talking about with all the goods, right? Like, what is all this traffic? It's trucks. What's on those trucks? Food, gear, supplies, aid station stuff, water. it's got to go somewhere, right? Because we all need it. Like you got to ship those goods into the mountain towns. So the bus ride took forever. We finally get out, and we got to Courmayeur at like 10 or 10:30. So everything was rushed. I'm like, okay, I got to drop off my drop bag. I got to eat. I got to find a bathroom. I got to line up. Then we get in the starting corral, right? It's like 11:15 p.m. The race is supposed to start at 11:50 p.m. At 11:48 p.m., Matthias, 11:48 p.m., they announce on the loudspeaker, hey, sorry, we're going to delay the start by 30 minutes. And we're all just standing there like, what? Like 6 hours ago, I started packing my bag. Then I walked to the bus. Then I sat on the bus for 2 hours. Then I got over here. Then I timed all my eating and my bathroom breaks so I could start this damn race at 11:50 p.m. And then it gets delayed. And then they also delayed it again, but we ended up starting at like 12:40 a.m. the next day or something, right? And all I could think was, and again, I just want to, give the caveat here, like, I'm super grateful I got to do the race. It was amazing. And I understand that with an organization this big, there's problems and challenges everywhere. But I just kept thinking, they have gone on and on and on and on about the 20th anniversary of UTMB. You're telling me after 20 years, you can't start your race on time?
You didn't see the beginning of UTMB, the main race, but I mean, they've been playing that Conquest of Paradise song at the beginning, but I think it wasn't properly timed, because usually the song starts playing and there's a little bit more of a start into it and sort of a countdown, and then it was like the song started playing. We were like, okay, I guess we're going to hear the song for a while, and everybody gets ready and hyped up and emotional, and then they like go, and people start running, and they're like, wait, are we running yet? I mean, it was really weird. So it's weird, right? Because we're picking, well, from the outside, especially with the start of UTMB, I'm picking on something really, really, small, right? But for you, that as a racer who thinks you can quickly hop over to your start, and then you have to calculate so much more time, and things are getting delayed. I mean, this could potentially be the make and break of your race, right? I mean, this
not to mention for many of the runners, I think most of us, right? Like, you probably got up at what, 8 or 9 that morning. So at that point, you've been up for 16, 18 hours. And then you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to run for another hour. I'm just going to stand here in the cold waiting for something to happen. And again, to be fair, the reason they delayed it is the buses that were coming over from Chamonix got delayed. Not all the runners were at the start, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And, part of me was like, well, isn't the race chip timed? So, like, couldn't they just start when they start? And then the chip time would give them that. But it just, if I had zoomed out weeks before the race, or even a year, and someone said, I'm going to give you 10 races around the world, Marathon des Sables, UTMB, Boston Marathon, London Marathon. Which ones do you think have a high percentage of starting on time? I would have said UTMB has a high percentage. I mean, they know what they're doing, right? They've been doing this 20 years. This is a high quality, high professional race. It is an international race that happens with runners from around the world. Thousands of runners expect this race to go off well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just very surprised that the race I was in got delayed for 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It just was so surprising to me.
I wonder if, well, I think there are two things. One thought that I have is that we all, and it's UTMB's fault, but we all, I think of UTMB so much more professional than they actually are. You say 20 years, but I think if you can calculate the first few years where they were sort of just bumbling around, where they didn't really know what they had, and then you consider the COVID years, and now you consider how much of their focus is around the World Series and not just that one event, right? How they're splitting their efforts and energies. I feel like the Polettis, they're still at the starting line, right? I mean, I'm not saying that they're the ones who are screwing up, but they are the ones who I think for themselves still see this a little bit as a family affair and not a professional events management company organized event. I think that's one thing. And the second piece is that I feel that of all the races that you just mentioned, I don't think that there is a single of all the sort of big, Ironman and big sort of mass event endurance of sport events. I think UTMB is by far the most complicated to manage, right? I mean, going onto these mountain regions, I mean, if the Boston Marathon is going to have a little bit of rain, well, what's the big deal, right?
Yeah.
And to be quite honest, the stories that I'm hearing of the start of the big world majors and how you're supposed to be managing yourself by bringing a jacket that you buy at Goodwill and you just throw it on the ground before you're starting because you can't do anything with the jacket, right? And how there's a sort of like best practices that have developed over the years of how you're supposed to be running those big marathons that almost sort of where the runners have found a way of adapting to the reality of how insane it is to run with 50,000 people, right? And I feel like UTMB, I mean, especially because your delay was not an organizational mistake as such, it was really weather related. I mean, if there's a landslide that happens and stuff, right? It almost feels, I'm not trying to, apologize, but I think
no, I don't want to be too harsh against UTMB either, because I am really grateful for what they've put on and what they gave me the opportunity to do. I guess as a race director myself, like I always try to think about all the extenuating circumstances. What if this road is closed? What if this happens? What if that happens? And you build in those time gaps. So if you have extenuating circumstances, you fix it and the race still goes off without a hitch, because it just, I might have 100 runners at my race, right? And I feel so responsible for the experience of those 100 runners. So when it's 1,600, it's like, oh my God, and like how many of us have spent thousands of dollars and trained for how many months and years to get to that starting line? And then, I don't know. But my criticism is not just that. It's the queuing, it's the aid stations, it's getting stuck in those conga lines going up the mountains. And, to that, someone could say, well, hey, Sam, just run faster, right? Like just get to the front of the pack. Right. Well, I mean, there's only so much you can do, right? Yeah. Like how many people can you really pass to get to the quote front of the race? And again, there were so many things that went right about the race, and it was such an incredible race. But at the same time, some of these aid stations, I'd get there and I'd say, hey, where's the bathroom? They'd point, there's 2 toilets, right? 2. And I look and I'm like, well, here's 500 runners and 2 toilets. I mean, I, as a race director, I know that's a bad idea. Like what? What's going on here? But then I think the counter is like, well, you're in the mountains. What do you expect, right? We're going to lug up all these porta potties to a mountain pass. So it's just it's a different world. It's a different ball game, and the logistics of having a race truly in the mountains, I think is unlike anything that many runners have ever experienced in their life.
I mean, I think perhaps it just shows a little bit the breaking point, not necessarily just of the organization, but of the location, right? That there is sort of a reality of how many people you can entertain in one location before it becomes not a good experience anymore, right? I think with every mass event, Disneyland is perfectly manufactured and organized and controlled and everything, but there is sort of a reality of how many people you can fit in before it becomes not a positive experience anymore, right?
Yeah.
And in some respects, because it's the outdoors, there is no government that puts a sign above the door and says, max capacity 120. But I wonder if sort of UTMB has truly reached the limit of how many people it can hold, right? But on the trails, on the aid station, managing across the week and stuff, perhaps it's just sort of a breaking point, and perhaps they have to sort of dial back a little bit. I looked at starting numbers compared to last year, and every single race again grew in numbers of runners who started the race, and I don't know how I would be as a race director if my races don't sell out. I don't have a wait list. I don't have to think about a lottery. I don't have to figure out how many people can I really fit on this race. How many more people can I give that experience, right? It's not just a cash grab, right? It's also like, this is such a unique loop and such an incredible location for an event. And, to your point, you're from Ohio, right? Why are you in Chamonix, right? It has such an incredible draw, and the fact that this organization tries so hard to allow you this experience, right? I mean, they could go the Hard Rock way and saying, we let Francois and Courtney and Killian run, and then we shut this thing down, right?
Yeah. And then it would lose some of the magic of what makes trail running, which is you get to toe the line with the elites. And I've said this every time. I use this example all the time. What are the chances of you playing basketball with LeBron James? Basically zero.
Yeah.
What are the chances of you starting at the same race as Courtney? Well, if you train your ass off, pretty high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You just play the lottery, you keep going. Eventually, you're going to be there at the same time she is. And if you get really good, you might even be able to keep up with her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you see videos of people all the time who are like, oh my God, I just ran with so-and-so for 5 seconds. And it's like, awesome, good.
Mm-hmm.
I hate this mythical celebrity status of these sporting figures. You get paid millions and millions and millions of dollars, and it's like we all dream of them and everything else. I mean, I'd much rather get to hang out with somebody and just say, hey, like, what, how do you approach that climb? Do you use trekking poles, whatever, and have that back and forth. It's one of the things I love about trail running. And yet the bigger it gets. And so an organization like UTMB and Ironman say, well, hey, we can really do something with this and just make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think in general, they did a really good job, and there were a lot of things that went right. But after taking a step back and finishing the race, I'm just like, why didn't they do wave starts? It's all chip timed anyway. Let the 100 fastest people go out at 11:50, and then everybody else 10 minutes behind. Get this queuing situation figured out.
Well, you don't want to start at 6-minute miles to scream out of town like an idiot.
I mean, yeah, it's just. It was just a very unique experience.
Yeah.
And I am, 90% grateful and happy with it. And then 10% like just skeptical and surprised and like, how haven't they figured this out yet? Why wasn't there someone at that aid station who spoke really good English? I mean, I know that sounds like so, elitist of me as an American, and I totally understand that, but 1,600 runners are coming through. Let's say half of them speak French. It's likely that the other half might have some understanding of English. So, like, where's the person at the aid station who speaks some English to help these people?
Yeah. And
in many of the scenarios I encountered, the questions I would ask in English were just met with blank faces, one after another. And again, I can't help but think that like someone's going to hear me say this and go, well, you're such an asshole. You think everybody should speak English? No, I don't. But if you have hundreds of runners who might need legitimate race assistance, and the only common language other than French is English, it really behooves you to have somebody there who speaks English.
Yeah. No, I think it's a difficult conversation. You're speaking to this that overarchingly, things went well and it was a great experience, but there are sort of these glaring issues that sort of come up. And again, it's not you being an elitist. It's not you saying, hey, I paid for this, somebody better, serve me properly, right? It's sort of because the experience was so great, you have high expectations. You're a race director yourself. you know how this is supposed to go. And so as some of the dust settles, you look back and you're saying, well, as much as they've figured out how to put the hooker banner everywhere, they clearly haven't figured out how to manage the starting correctly, right? I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like and perhaps it's a weird example, but when I came over to the US 20 some years ago, I remember, it's a super weird example. Bear with me here. I had heard about Starbucks, and Starbucks 25 years ago was like this amazing company, right? Third place, brewing great coffee, creating these amazing community places, right? And so I had read about it, was excited about it. At that time, Starbucks weren't in Europe yet. And so I came over and I wanted a job at Starbucks. And while we were trained to serve great coffee, I mean, I said it in air quote, but at least that's what, there was that how many seconds the shots of espresso were supposed to pour, right? The back rooms of these coffee shops that I worked in, they were all a gigantic mess. And Starbucks had absolutely no plan or idea how to manage these back rooms where the computer was, where the chocolate powder was sitting, where the coffee beans were stored, right? There was no like system there. Everybody was sort of like flying by the seat of their pants. Growth was incredible. We opened a store, 3 new stores around the world every single day. And I think that's what UTMB sort of feels like, right? It feels shiny and amazing, and clearly the images that it creates are the absolute best images. Right? And if you see these runners running over a ridge with these white gleaming glaciers in the distance, right? That this is the pinnacle of what trail running is supposed to look like in our sort of dream scenarios, and yet they are building a monster that they can't really tame yet, right? They haven't really figured out how do you get support from aid station to aid station? How do you, I mean, I was going to ask you, you're vegan, how did you eat at the aid stations, given that they're cutting giant chunks of cheese for you, right? I mean,
it was funny. I mean, they had my partner who came to the Beaufort aid station. As she commented, she was like, that was a full charcuterie board. I mean, it was like 3 different types of cheeses and meat and all this stuff. I mean, it was fine. I ate a lot of bread. They had dark chocolate that was vegan. They had vegetable broth. They had some really good figs that were quite good. And then I supplemented with stuff that I brought too. So it ended up being fine. They had a sponsor, that NAC brand, NAAK. They had a bunch of vegan bars and stuff. But to your point, I mean, they have created a monster, right? And like, people love big, crazy things. And I think the challenge for UTMB is going to be in the next 1 to 5 years, with all of this cash that they must be getting from all these crazy races all over the world. They're like 38 majors now or whatever, and Ironman and everything else. Are they going to fix these issues and rise to the challenge? Or are they going to just kind of go, you know what? People are going to show up anyway. Who cares? And I feel like it could go one of either ways. Either way. But I should mention that for all of that, like, the thing about the race itself that I have never seen in the United States was the way that the way the course was designed.
Okay.
To go from a city to a suburb, to a park, to a national park, to a mountaintop, to a pasture, and then all the way back down. And that was like 10 miles. So it was like that times 10, And I just kept thinking, you know how many permits this would take in the United States?
Yeah.
This would take like 100 different permits and cost like $100,000 to secure the permitting for a race like this in the United States. And you would inevitably run into some national forest or national park that would just say, no effing way. We won't let more than 10 people go through here.
Yep.
And you'd be like, well, wait a minute, I have like 1,600 who want to come. And they'd say, that's our quota for the year. See you later.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really impressive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no criticism there. The way they pulled off that course, I mean, you felt like you were in the most remote Alp region ever. And then all of a sudden you're in a city, you know? And it's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. City, mountaintop, city, mountaintop. Totally unbelievable. And I've never experienced that in a race before.
And
So
and
maybe
to your point, essentially impossible to recreate over here because of the permit issue and because of the distances. You just don't have towns anywhere being close to such iconic and incredible locations, because farming and culture and thousands of years of civilization and tourism and the focus on tourism have created these landscapes and created the mindset that it is actually welcome to have tens of thousands of runners and spectators come to Chamonix. I know that people in Chamonix are sort of like aching under the onslaught of UTMB every year, but I mean, the restaurants are making bank, right? I mean, all the hotels are sold out, right? I mean, there's a huge different way of looking at this as a way of saying this is an economic driver. When you look at the sponsors of these individual races on the UTMB website, you see that these regions, these valleys, these cities are actively sponsoring and supporting UTMB events, right? Which is something that you would never get over here, right? I mean, over here, it's like, how much can we charge you if you may have a successful event, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to that, I'll say that like the local counties that I host my races in, I mean, they're all about it, but are they giving me money? No, they're giving me permission.
Yes, and they're charging you, right?
Well,
sometimes,
yeah, but very little, very little.
Okay.
I mean, we're very lucky in Ohio that like we don't have. I don't think we have the same setup as maybe the West Coast or Colorado, where like it becomes very expensive to do these races. A lot of the counties and a lot of the state forests and state parks in Ohio, they're happy to have people coming in and tourism. So they do charge fees and they do require permits, but they're very reasonable and they're very kind. And they're typically very welcoming of these events. But yeah, they're not like paying me to host the race. They're not coming to me and begging me to come there, you know, and like giving me money for these things. And yeah, the financial model behind something like UTMB is really fascinating to observe up close and personal, because like you said, it's like, wow, that's a lot of Hoka banners. That's like 1,000 Hoka banners on the course. Like
Hoka is almost, I mean, I ran canyons in April and I felt like the Hoka logo I almost saw more often than the UTMB logo, right?
You want to know something funny? So I keep talking about my partner who was there for the whole race. So she saw, and we're not on video on the thing, but you know, you can see the shirt, right? It's a Hoka shirt, but then the UTMB logo with the Dacia thing right there. She thought that the Dacia logo was just like some French word, and that Hoka was the title sponsor.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you go and you look at the race, the Hoka logo is actually so much more visible than the Dacia logo that it seems like Hoka really is the big overall sponsor. But then like Dacia is just kind of like in there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it was really weird when I started looking around. I was like, oh, that's kind of true.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me think like, how many, I don't know. What do you think? You think Hoka paid $1 million to UTMB? 2 million? I mean, what do you think it actually was?
I have no idea what the numbers are.
Yeah.
There's been some stuff floating around, a balance sheet that was published by some guy who UTMB balance sheet, and that Matt Walsh from Trail Mix from the UK has a Substack newsletter posted, and was saying that I think the revenue split is 60% of the revenue comes from bibs and 30% comes from sponsorship deals. I don't know. Hoka's been affiliated with UTMB for a few years. I don't know how many years they were locked in and how all of this works, right? So I can't say, but the amount of money that Hoka puts in on top of it, right? You and I are race directors. It's nice to get some, gear or some cash from a sponsor, but Hoka on top of it must have paid for all these banners, right? I mean, I don't think
Yeah, I don't
that
know.
UTMB says, okay, I'll take your $1 million and now I'm going to go and print all these additional
Yeah.
banners, right? I mean, it's insane. But circling back to the Korean trail runners, nobody has a problem with Hoka coming in, even though they make plastic shoes, and their shoes aren't really known to be super long lasting, right?
Yeah.
That's their one big criticism. Yet somehow nobody has a complaint with that. So that's where this whole thing, to me, falls apart. And I actually do think that the more sponsors, and I think that's for me the big hope, the more sponsors can sort of supplement and sustain the organization, the more these bibs can stay reasonable. Because what's crazy is that signing up for UTMB is cheaper dollar for dollar than signing up for some of the biggest races in the US, right? So they have not done a giant cash grab, which is something, some way how they clearly could regulate the masses that coming to Chamonix. Given that there is such an insane demand, they could charge $1,000 for a ticket and people would still sell out the event, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was very surprised when I finally paid my fee for TDS this year that I don't think it was more than $200 US.
It's nuts.
I've paid way more than that for 100 milers here in the US with about 1/10 of the amenities, if not 1/20th. And not only that, but like you were expected to provide your own transportation to aid stations and all this other stuff, And I mean, UTMB is just giving you all this merch and giving you rides everywhere and all this stuff. And yeah, they didn't start the race on time, but hey, whatever.
Right.
So it's really hard, I think, to come to a conclusion on it, right? Like I'm someone who's very like data driven, and I like to come to the end of something and go, okay, was it good or bad? And there's really just no way to make that assumption. I'm really happy with the fact that I showed up and did the race and finished. And, I wish I had run faster time, but it is what it is. But there were just so many unique experiences, and some of them were good and some of them were bad. And, would I go back? I mean, you didn't ask that question, but I'll answer it. Like, I would like to go back. I don't know if I would ever do TDS again, and I don't know if I would ever do UTMB again.
Ooh.
I might do CCC or OCC, but to be out there for that long, like, I think I only needed to be out there for about 24 hours to experience the magic.
This is what I always say.
And then I was like, cool. I have experienced sufficient amounts of magic and mountains. I am ready to be done. So I'm thinking like the 50K, 100K distance would be pretty good for me.
I mean, I hope that my best friend and running partner doesn't hear that, because he desperately wants me to sign up for UTMB. And I feel the same way. I'm like, running through the night is a magical experience. It's so 24 hours, right? I'm not saying I'm just going to do, half marathons. I love the idea of an ultra and really pushing yourself. But 24 hours seems like a reasonable amount of time. And everything else after feels absolutely insane. So,
I mean, the longest race I had done prior to this was about 30 hours. And yeah, I remember when I hit hour 30, I think, of this race, I looked at my watch and I was like, oh, interesting. I still have like 20 more miles to go.
Oh man.
It just drug on and drug on and drug on. And, it's like, in some ways it's really impressive. It's like, wow, it took me almost double the amount of time it took some of these finishers to do it. Like, I got my money's worth, right? They say that. And then in other ways, it's like, it'd be cool to just go see some of those peaks on my own and not be up there with like all this pain and fatigue and everything else.
So if you would go back, would you go back because and run a shorter distance because you just don't want to suffer that much, or because you were drawn to the atmosphere, the hype in Chamonix, and you want to experience that, but in a more reasonable way with less of the stress? And like, is that the draw? Or is the mountains a draw? Because you could like run Eiger or, Zugspitze, some of the
Yeah.
other races too, but then you're not in Chamonix. Like, let's talk a little bit. And I know we were already pushing the time here. I'm just going to keep you until you wave the white flag. you know, the atmosphere in Chamonix, I think, is a unique atmosphere.
Oh yeah.
Was that worth it? Did you get your money's worth there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I got to see so many brands and products that I've never seen before. I got to go to a Solomon store. Like, I'm a huge Solomon fan, and actually go into one of their stores and see everything laid out, and go to all these different shops. And I'm also like a fan of like climbing and mountaineering, and I like dabble in that stuff. So to see all that gear, yeah, it was incredible. And I saw a lot of amazing people and met a lot of amazing people. I saw Scott Jurek at one point, just like walk by. So I just like went over and said hello to him, and it's like, where else in the world but Chamonix, of course,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it was worth it. I would definitely do some things differently if I went back, maybe in terms of where I stayed, or how I set up my time when I arrived, when I left. Um, and but yeah, I mean, if I'm gonna go out for 40 hours, I'd almost rather do like, I don't know, like I'd rather do like a Mont Blanc summit, like I'd
Mm-hmm.
rather do like a mountaineering attempt
Mm-hmm.
than you run for a full day, and then it's like, okay, let's go run again for another day, but this time you're really tired and you're really sore. And I don't know. I mean, I say this, Matthias, right? Like, watch me go sign up for something next. I'm probably going to do it, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because we all have short-term memory with this stuff, and then you get on, you start looking at the videos, and you're like, oh, that was actually really fun. I want to do that again. But yeah, I think it would just be cool to be back in an environment again. But there's so much other stuff in the world that I want to like try, and rock climbing and mountaineering stuff I want to do, sky running, all the other stuff in Switzerland, Zagama, and it looks incredible. And to me, this was just a gateway to that stuff, because it's like, wow, trail running in Europe is legit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no one can argue that.
Mm-hmm.
It is a real legitimate sport there, with money and fans and infrastructure and sponsors, and people really, really, really care about it. And the culture has this trail running embedded into it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if you're 18 or 80, you're out on the trail, hiking, running, climbing, whatever. And that's just not the case in many places in the United States. And it's sadly not the case in Ohio. And so to be in a place like that, this is indescribable.
Mm-hmm. Do you, as a race director, did you take some inspiration away from this?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I'll give a couple of examples. The way they did photography was really interesting. So they had photographers all over the course, and they all upload their photos into this massive, massive database. And you then, instead of having to look through like 20,000 photos, which would just be impossible for most people, you upload a selfie, and it does facial recognition,
Wow.
and it shows you your photos.
That's impressive because I've seen it done with bib numbers, but there is
Yeah.
too many false
Mm-hmm.
positives, bibs not properly showing. Facial
Right.
recognition is insane. That's
I
next
was,
level.
it is next level, and I was super impressed by that. And then it gets even crazier. Here's the second part. Let's say that there was a photo where like your face was down or like covered with a buff or something. You upload a GPX file of your race, and it matches your location to when and where the photos were taken. And so you look through a subset of like 20 photos, and you say, oh yeah, that's me right there.
Wow.
And then it collates all these photos into one group, and it just charges you a flat fee to download all of them together. I mean, I was like, in some ways, I was like, really? You're going to charge me €60 to download these photos when I just spent how many thousands of dollars to go to Chamonix? Come on, UTMB. And then I was like, yeah, this is actually kind of tight though, because like, you just took all the race photos out of like thousands and like grouped mine into this one batch,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just going to give them to me for a flat fee. Like, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really impressive. I mean, I would love to do something like that one day. Not that I really need to, because I don't have that many runners, but it was just so impressive how they did that. And yeah, I mean, I think the big thing with this race, like UTMB, Tour de Jean, a lot of these Golden Trail races, is the branding, right?
Mm-hmm.
The branding is just like boom in your face. And you show up to the start line or the finish or even an aid station, and you just can't help but go, wow. And it's that wow factor where when you're recounting that race to your friend, they see that excitement in your eyes and they go, well, I got to do that race too. And then that word of mouth just generates and generates. And that's how more people sign up for your race. I mean, that's better than any Facebook ad or anything else, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
the word of mouth from other runners. Hey, I had an amazing experience and you will too if you do this race.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I really want to continue to do that with my races. And, whether it's a Western States or UTMB or, I don't know, Mohican 100. I mean, that's one we have here, Burning River, like any race that has a great runner experience, like that's what's going to keep drawing people and having them bring their friends and so on and so forth.
How did you feel like getting to the finish line as a runner? Because as a race director for small race, and that is one of the big sort of feathers in our North American race directors caps, is that we are at the finish line, we high five, we hug, we welcome people. 1,600 runners, I mean, even if half DNF, right? I mean, it's impossible for the Polettis to be at the finish line other than for Walmsley and Courtney, right?
Right.
How did you experience that finish line as a runner coming in after 48 hours, right? Chamonix, you're speaking about the branding. At what time of day did you come in, right?
I got in at like 2:30 p.m. So like it was daylight. And like I knew I would finish in daylight. Because I just sort of timed it out, it was very mixed. In one way, I was really grateful to be finishing, and you're running through Chamonix, and like before you actually get to the finishing chute, there's not really any markings, so you're just like on a street with like people, and everyone's like cheering and like going nuts for you, and you're like, thanks, like, and then you're like, oh yeah, everyone here knows what I'm doing. I mean, I have never experienced a race like that. Even the biggest trail races I've done, if you come across a hiker on the trail, they might go like, what are you doing? What's that bib you have on?
Yeah.
Everyone in town was fully aware of what I had just gone through. And even the people on the trail, like when Americans would see me on the trail, like when they were doing like a Tour de Mont Blanc or a section hike or whatever, they would go, oh my God, an American doing TDS. And they would like go nuts for me, I mean, I probably had more people cheer for me in TDS than have cheered for me in every other ultra I've done in the United States. This is crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts.
So in that sense, yeah, it was incredible. But I also was in so much pain. My feet hurt so bad. And I felt like I had really sort of sabotaged my own race by like not taking care of my feet and changing my socks. And, it just like every step was just like burning pain. And so I run through the finishing line. There's an announcer there, and he says something like, Samuel Hartman from, United States, Ohio. And he said something really interesting. He said, I hope you enjoyed our little adventure through our big mountains.
Nice.
And I thought that was pretty cool because it was actually like personalized to me. Like it felt like he was saying, hey, you're not from around here and you just did this crazy thing. I hope you enjoyed it. And so even though he wasn't the race director, the fact that there was someone there like saying that to me and I got to like shake his hand, that was pretty cool. Like cool. I liked that. Yeah. But I'll be honest, like I finished the race. I found my partner. We took some photos. And then I just was like, I'm done. Like, Get me to the Airbnb.
Cart me out.
Yeah, like I don't want any more fanfare. I saw runners sitting there like smiling, eating a baguette, and I was like, how can you be doing that, right? I just hurt so bad. I was in so much pain. I wanted the whole world to fade away at that point. I wanted to be transported to my Airbnb.
Yeah.
And eventually, I slept, I showered, I started to recover, and then the feelings of joy arose, and I was like, holy shit, that was like really hard,
That is a perfect way of bringing this to a close. You did something absolutely incredible, and we had an interesting conversation because we essentially didn't talk about your race much. We talked about a lot of the exterior things, which I think is fascinating. And there are tons of race reports out there, and you're going to write one up. And when you send me the link, I'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah.
So people want to actually hear how the race went, then they can read up on this. I loved the conversation. I loved your openness, your critical way of sort of like dissecting your experience. And I mean, in reality, I think it's always a little bit of a mixed bag, and it always depends a little bit on what moment you're thinking about this experience. But it changed you. It's something that's going to stay with you forever. It's something that is something incredibly unique, even though 1,600 runners did it too, right?
Right. Yeah.
But
it did. I mean, it really did show me that, like, for most, I don't think it's a stretch to say for most Americans, if you get into trail running, you're going to go to a race with a few hundred people at best. And you're going to do this thing, and you're going to be like, okay, that was cool. And then it's like a hobby, and it's a hobby that's like this big, right? And if you go to your buddy the next day at work, we all know the trope, right? Hey, I just ran a 50K. And they're like, what? How many miles is that? No comprehension from 99% of the public here in America of what this world is. And then you go to Chamonix, and 99% of the people there completely understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really validating to go, oh, I'm not crazy. This is really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you like live in that world full time, most of us go back home. And then it's like, you're out walking one day, and you see somebody run by, and they're like wearing a shirt for a local 10K, and you're like, oh, that's like still a thing, isn't it? Like 10Ks. Like they're not wearing a shirt that says your local 150K.
Mm-hmm. It is a different world that feels to us like it's our universe. It feels like a gigantic place with, if you're in Chamonix, thousands of people, but we are in a really, really, really tiny bubble.
Yeah. And I hope that changes, because I think that trail running in its core, at least for me, and what I've seen happen with so many people, is it takes you out of your little world and puts you in nature. And the more time you can spend in nature, like off your phone and just like being in the trees and the mountains is a good thing. I think there's so few downsides to that there's so many positives, that whatever we lose by the growth of trail running, we're going to gain in the physical and the mental health of the people who end up in the woods.
Yes, 100%. I always call them micro adventures. I mean, the reason why I got into trail running is because I felt like it was the safest of the adventure sports. I wasn't base jumping. I've got kids at home. Right. I can't really justify crazy, scary, hairy things. And the chances for me to come back after a big outing in the mountains when I'm trail running is much higher than many other sports. And that's why I picked it. But then races on top of it make these adventures even more accessible. And I think, to your point, that's the good thing about our sport, right? That you can have people like you who says, I know how to do mountaineering. If that race would have gone over the summit of Mont Blanc, then I would have appreciated it even more, right? You could have run this route by yourself, with some food cache somewhere or so, right? But A lot of people, they don't have the ability to mark a course for them, a route for themselves and comfortably run it. A lot of people are not comfortable in nature alone. They wouldn't want to be out there following flags, and knowing that there's an aid station, a live base every few miles gives them that comfort that they need, that they can even experience, right? And it's not right for us to be elitists and say, well, if you can't be out in nature by yourself, then you shouldn't be out there. No, we want more people out, right? We want people to experience these positive benefits from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, at the end of the day, the goal is to just be in nature. And what I define as nature is like basically almost everything of what I'm not currently in, because we know, at least for folks in the West, folks in the United States, how many moments of our life are spent inside, indoors, in a city, in a suburb, in a house, metal, glass, steel, wood walls, and the air is filtered, things are fake. And you just want to be out in nature and like experience that. And it could be an hour or it could be 38 hours. But some people I've found don't have a concept of that because they don't have the thought that it's accessible. And that's what I'm trying to do with my races, is change that. And the format is something that is well understood, which is a race. If I could draw people out by just saying like, hey, you're all just going to go out there and come back whenever you want, well, I would do that. But that's like kind of dangerous, and people might not understand that as well. So, if you draw on the format of a race, then it's a format that everybody understands, but they're going to have that moment where they're out there and there's no one around. And it's like, oh my God, here's this giant tree. Or like, oh my God, I just almost stepped off the trail and fell. Or there's a rattlesnake or whatever, And I'll say there were moments in TDS where there was nobody around. Like there were a few moments where I would look back and forth and no one was there. And I was like, whoa, this is really cool. That was really neat.
Amazing. Samuel, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I very, very much appreciate your perspective, your experience, your passion in all of this. Thanks for bringing these awesome stories from Chamonix back to here, the listeners of Singletrack, but also to me, because I've been in Chamonix many years before UTMB ever happened, but I've not run any of the races, and I'm working hard getting my stones to hopefully next year or the following be at the starting line.
Yeah. Well, you're so welcome. I appreciate you having me on, and it was a wild journey. I'm glad that I survived and made it back home, and thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me, and for everybody for listening to this crazy saga of a flatlander from Ohio goes to run in the mountains.
Fantastic. Before we go, do you have any links you want to share with the audience? Things, your website, Instagram, whatever you have.
Yeah, sure. I'm on Instagram. It's at Sam_medal, SAM_METAL. And then my race company is TINAR Race Series, TINAR Race Series. We have a ultra coming up in October called the Pike Lake Ultra Marathon, and then another race coming up in November called the Alley Trail Marathon. They're both here in Ohio. Lots of fun. Can't promise you the experience of UTMB, but we do the best we can, and it's a really good time. So if you're anywhere local and you want to come out and have a great experience on the trails, we'd love to have you.
Sam promises that the race will start on time.
Yes, it will. I can tell you that. We did 1 year. We had to delay like 5 minutes, and I've never forgot it. And it bugs me to this day. I am such a stickler about starting the damn race on time. I tell you what. So yes, you can hold me to that. Our races will start on time.
Fantastic. All right, Samuel, I'll let you go. Put your feet back up. You're still on recovery mode. Take it all in, and we'll talk some more later.
Thank you, Matthias. Have a great night. Thank you so much.